This is a talk and a tribute to the great works of Walter Russell and Russellian science. If you've never heard of Walter Russell, it's time that you do, especially if you're a scientist. It would behoove anyone of any frame of mind and any particular creed to study the works of Walter Russell. I can guarantee you that it will be enlightening. Hello everyone, welcome back to Still Point Radio. This is your host Ryan McMahon. Happy to be back. Good evening, good day, good morning, good night, wherever you may be. Buckle up. As usual, we're going to create some conscious content, stuff that changes the world. I have here today Matt Presti, the president of the University of Science and Philosophy in Waynesboro, Virginia, a university dedicated to Russellian science, named after Walter Russell, a great scientist as well as philosopher, sculptor, luminary, and artist. I also have with me the university's lead scientist. His name is Darren Colomb. We're going to talk about the nature of the universe, the nature of motion, the incandescence of light, the cubic waveform model, whether or not electrons, protons, and atoms actually exist. We'll even go into Maxwell's field equations and discover whether or not they are aberrations of the human mind or whether they actually exist in the real world. And it's going to take some courage. So, quoting the great psychiatrist and psychologist Thomas Szasz, clear thinking requires not intelligence but courage. Thomas Szasz. Quoting the great philosopher Johannes Wolfgang von Goethe, seeing is how we perceive. Science, by nature, is a paradox. The goal is to balance our outer sight with inner sight, nucleate our own opposites. That's how we solve this paradox. We'll also go into what it is to be genius, where genius comes from, and how, as human beings, we can access it. So this is an incredible talk. We're going to unlock some of those doors and open up some of the perceptive abilities in the mind, the intuitive faculties that actually make a great scientist as well as a great philosopher. So, here we go. Into creation mechanics and meta science. So, welcome Matt Presti and welcome Darren Colomb.
Thank you.
Thanks, Ryan.
You're welcome. I wanted to start off kind of what we were just talking about is just we're going to take people, the way I see this, we're going to take people into language that may be foreign to them. So I'm going to just there's going to be things I want to talk about, like certain terms like still magnetic light, the nature of motion, and the cubic waveform model. I think a lot of people have never even heard of still magnetic light or the cubic waveform. And these are the things I feel are going to potentially change our physics paradigm and change our science paradigm for a greater future for our children's children's, because the way that I look at and understand Walter Russell that was so inspiring to me is that it's a science that is verifiable and testable here on planet Earth, and it's reflected in nature. And so if we have a science that's reflected in nature and we can actually test it here on Earth, it's going to be more balanced and less entropy based. So what I mean by that is that we're not using fossil fuels in the future for our energy source and disrupting the equilibrium of Mother Nature and the Earth. So the first question for either one of you guys is, can you guys describe just in general the cubic waveform model and how it's different from the atomic theory, or I guess you'd say quantum mechanics, quantum physics?
Well, quantum mechanics is it's one half of a so-called unifying theory, one that describes small scale, and then there's general relativity that describes large scale, and they're trying to smash these two together, and they don't play well. So really, what we're dealing with Russell science is something much more close to what I call creation mechanics, or just how anything in the universe is created, even the universe itself. So it's very much beyond any kind of theoretical assertion or theoretical musings, poking around at things at the small scale and things at the large scale. It's actually one set of mechanics that describes how everything comes into being, not just small particles or large particles, right? Um, Dr. Russell called this a cubic wave field model, in that there's nothing in creation other than waves, light waves specifically, and these waves are bounded by planes of zero curvature and internal planes of zero curvature, which subdivide one cube into eight, giving us eight plus a centering zero, which is nine, and nothing in nature ever exceeds nine. There's nine octaves in his periodic table, which displays elements that were previously never discovered, but were verified later and given different names by the people who supposedly discovered them. So it's a very different way of looking at the universe. It dispels a lot of the theoretical aspects that academics are trying to get at, and really gets to the source of putting together all the best aspects of spirituality and science. It really brings the two of them together into one consistent cosmology.
Beautifully. That's well said. Creation mechanics. That's a great way to describe it. I love that. I wanted to sort of ask you, when I hear that word creation mechanics, it reminds me of the Hermetic principles, and the first one being as above, so below, or as within, so without. So if I'm hearing you correctly, what you're saying is this this trying to pair these two theories together, and they're not playing well. What you were saying earlier is kind of like denying the first Hermetic principle, if you will, of everything in the cosmos that's on a large scale is being patterned and organized in the exact same way by the exact same universal force on the small and microcosmic scale. Does that sort of work for what you're saying?
Yeah, in other words, when you look at an atom, for instance, an atom of carbon, if you were to visualize it, all you have to do is look up into the heavens and look at a spiral galaxy, and you'll see the exact same formation. In fact, every nucleal center is not exactly a solid mass. There's only one instance in the wave in which that's actually true, and that's at carbon, or what we call the wave amplitude. It's where if you imagine a sinusoid, it's where the crest and the trough is located. At that position, you've accumulated maximum potential by compression from the outside to the inside. And so it isn't a nuclear mass in the way that they teach it, where all elements have a nuclear mass full of protons and neutrons of a certain weight with orbital electrons around it. What Russell is really endeavoring to teach us is that there's a wave structure behind all so-called particles or particulate. A particle mass is really only an accumulation of waves in a smaller volume or smaller region of space. And so based on all of our test equipment and what we have available to us to our limited senses, it appears to be a particle mass. And that's what led to this whole explosion of trying to describe everything using particles. But in reality, it's the underlying mechanics behind everything is waves. Everything has a wave structure because everything is created and it lives. It has a life and death cycle, and that is fundamentally based upon the structure of the wave.
Yes. So in the wave, of course, when things are moving in waves and in wave fields, you constantly have um, this balance, right? And the balance, if I understand it correctly, the balance in nature is like moving through, or well, this is a big question too, motion. But for all intents and purposes, I'll say moving through fields of space. So is that what we would call like a field perturbation?
Well, a field, so the best way, and I've answered this a few times about fields, but fields have everything to do with your mind. When you throw a ball up in the air, you put a certain amount of your own impetus into that ball, right, in order to make it move.
Uh-huh.
And that's an action, right? The ball leaves your hand. And then when it hits a point of suspension where it completely stops and it hangs in midair. That's another reversal point. That's the boundary of one wave field. And you've defined the extension, the amount of that wave field with your mind because you extended a certain amount of energy, and then that energy runs out of gas, and then it stops, and then it reverses and it comes back to your hand. So every wave field has everything to do with the amount of desire that you have. So in essence, we aren't aware of this with our limitations of being human, but there's you could say there's a wave field that encompasses the entire universe.
Right.
Uh, and then there's subsequently smaller wave fields within that, all the way down to infinity. So it goes in infinitely large and infinitely small, but it has everything to do with your mind.
That's amazing. I mean, so many people, I think, in the scientific community, being just primarily left brain materialist reductionists, are not typically are not going to allow themselves to even use the term mind with science. And so this is a huge mistake, obviously, because if I'm hearing you correctly, the fields that are basically created by the desire of our mind are just what we would say in philosophical terms like ways of seeing or ways of perceiving. So if people can accept and can go into this more holistic view of physics and science, they're going to be able to move out of their left brain and into their right brain, and um, I think hopefully be able to see things not from a sort of armchair theory approach, but to see things like from their own, if you will, from their own center. Things would be like balanced, like they themselves are in the center of the universe, so to speak, because we are dictating our own reality to some degree, or at least the way we perceive reality. Does that sound correct?
Yeah, well, everyone is the lord of their own universe, I guess you would say. We everybody's looking out and seeing some kind of reality that they're witnessing, but really it's all vibratory motion. And vibratory motion is an extension from a fulcrum. And the important thing to realize is that you are that fulcrum. You are that fulcrum, and you as self is also God. God is the same thing, and that's why I say it's really mind. When I hesitate to use the word God, because especially in a science discussion,
Right.
because there's a trend or a fashion to be sort of an atheist when you're in the sciences, to not really tread into the ground of what the soul is, what the self is. But to me, that's kind of the wrong direction. You want to go in that direction because you can't have a good science without answering some very fundamental metaphysical questions, philosophical questions. So I think one of the reasons this is a university of science and philosophy is that the science needs the philosophy and the philosophy needs the science.
Yes, yeah, and that's something that I talk about a lot, because I'm heavily into etymology and into words, and one of the things I bring up to people when I talk is the word science itself, and I connect it to the word conscience. So con meaning with, and science, referring to sentience or self-awareness, and it's so odd when I bring this up to people. They never realize that the root word in which we get science has to do with not your outer perception of the world, but it starts with your subjectivity, your inner perception of the world. So I always tell people, science is actually a philosophy, and you guys, following up the work of Walter Russell, have brought this together in a University of Science and Philosophy, and it's so important that people understand and see that all of our theories and our approaches, they come from the mind of man, or you could even go further, like you said, from from his inner light or from his soul. So I think it's just amazing that we have scientists like yourself that are just going, look, this is not just my spiritual, particular spiritual belief, but this is the way nature is reflecting it as well. This idea of the fulcrum, and the balance of things. If I could, I mean, I know we could go in so many different directions with this, but I wanted to kind of read from Walter Russell's book, Secret of Light. So let's see here. This is page 134. It's The Desire for Balance. Walter Russell, The Secret of Light. All things seek balance. Two opposed, unbalanced halves of one are forever seeking to balance their opposition. Two children on a seesaw are balanced when they are on a level with their centering fulcrum. And when they are on two different levels, they are then unbalanced in their centering fulcrum. They are then dynamic. The fulcrum no longer centers them, although they are balanced in themselves. In such a position, the key that they are obliged to move. Repetition of their motion is impossible while they are in balance and with their fulcrum, but it is imperative when the fulcrum no longer centers them. So, I mean, hopefully that sort of points to what we're talking about, is that, like you said a second ago, that each person is the center of their universe, and that each person acts as a fulcrum as they move through reality.
Yeah, it's very well said. And even movement. One thing that maybe people can try is when you're going for a walk or something, try to figure out if you're moving or if the world is moving around you and you're staying put. Is there any way to tell that one is more correct than the other? And this will begin to get your mind comfortable with the various illusions of motion. But really, what we have is when I say creation mechanics, it's a way of taking a quality, an idea, a thing which is not manifested physically, but rather is just concept, and the way in which mind divides one static condition into two dynamic conditions to allow it to set it in motion. Just like you can take a film reel and you know that you're holding in that reel, say it's Hamlet, you know that the entire story, the entire play, the concept, the idea of Hamlet is within that one canister, within that one reel. But then you take it out and you set it in motion, you put it on a reel and move it past a light, and now you project it, and now you have the idea of a continuity, of a beginning, a middle, and an end. And that's very much what God does in order to simulate his one idea of love into the entirety of creation, the entire universe, all of the people, all of everything, quite literally everything, is done in that manner. So it's a very powerful way to look at what the universe is and your relation to it, most importantly.
Yeah, the relation to it. I think that's what we're getting at, is like how one relates to their inner self and, of course, their outer self. So I also, speaking of motion, I've made a couple videos out of Walter Russell's work, mostly where I'm just reading and quoting from him, and then trying to break it down in my kind of language, more layman language. And one of the ones I get the most feedback on is whether or not this concept of whether or not motion really exists, or maybe another way to say it is that whether or not light is actually moving. So if we were to ask you that, Darren, if light is supposed to be the fastest thing in the universe, and the universe is boundless, so there's no box containing it, there's no boundaries, how can something infinite and boundless be moving at all? I mean, wouldn't it be still?
It's a good question. It would be still. This is the power of understanding polarity, because you can't have motion without non-motion, can you? In other words, you can't set anything in motion unless something does not move. Just like if you were in pure black empty space, there's no way to tell if you were standing still or moving. But if an object moves past you, now you have a reference point to say that I'm moving in respect to this object, or the flip side is that the object is moving relative to you. So with light, we have these kinds of illusions. We have when things are seemingly in motion, we have the illusions of continuities in a linear time flow. But really, to make that illusion what it is, you have to void it. Everything in the universe is voided as it occurs, and then it is repeated as it is voided. That's one of Russell's laws of thermodynamics, that basically nothing does move, but we ignore half of a wave cycle. Our senses are limited, and they only allow us to see the radiative half of the cycle, the death half. This is what led to the idea of entropy, which really dominates the thinking of our scientists today. So really, the limitation of the senses gives us what we experience as our linear sense of time, and this is all achieved by motion. So it can be a bit confusing for the student getting acquainted with Russell to realize that, okay, all matter is an illusion of motion, but then you read at some point in his work that also that the motion itself is an illusion because everything is voided back to zero. So everything comes from zero and returns to zero. So it's a bit of a mind bender, but the more you stick with it, the more it becomes comfortable, and the more you realize that it's really the limitation of our senses, which it gives us the beautiful illusion of things moving in time.
Gotcha. So okay, so that sparks a couple things with me. First, the limitations of our senses also translates to me as the limitation of our language or our ability to articulate it. And this is where I fall short a lot, where I can read Walter Russell or listen to you guys, listen to your work when you speak, and I can track with it. And I go, okay, I got it. Like I get it. I can feel it. To some degree that my perception is centered and is correct. It's an intuitive feeling. However, a couple moments later, when I try to articulate it with the words that we use in the English language, I always feel the limits of my syntax, or my where I'm jumping off from, my approach to language. So I think a lot of people get hung up, myself included, where we have to use words like motion in a sentence to basically describe that there is no motion. It's like sort of that one of those weird sort of looping catch 22s. Would you agree with that? I mean, you're very good at articulating this, but does language hold us back to some degree when describing these very deep metaphysical concepts?
Absolutely. I am a big fan of Alan Watts, and he
Oh
would
yeah.
discuss this topic quite a bit about how language is so limiting, and you're it's just like what I was saying before, where you have a concept, and that mind, the concept occurs within the mind, and then you have to give it a body form. And the easiest, the most readily available way to do that is to speak it. But now you have to divide, you have to separate that concept into discrete bits of information in order to simulate it, in order to begin speaking and try to make a point when you're finished.
Right.
So
Right.
science is definitely a language, and it different. We try to get all on the same page and have standard definitions, but when we're dealing with Russell science, it's very important to know that we need to relearn and redefine certain words to fit a two-way moving universe rather than a one-way moving universe. So, for instance, entropy existing on its own is not possible. It must have an equal and opposite reactionary force, which you might have to make up a word and say it's centropic now, or now you're in a position where you have to make up words because the concept which led to the initial set of words is no longer adequate.
Well, it's one thing to make up words, which I think is important because our language needs to evolve, and it's another thing to make up theories. Like, well, I mean, I've got to call out Einstein. I mean, um, based on everything that I've read of Einstein, it's very, very little of it is is sound. Very little of it is verifiable and testable, and we have all these theories that exist from literally from an armchair, right? So that you can't actually test. Like one person's here on the ground, and they're holding a watch at the same time as someone else in a rocket ship 20 light years away, and we're supposed to be able to test this, right? But the laboratory is non-existent in this situation. So I think that what's beautiful about Russell's work is that, and hopefully it's okay if I basically call him this. Would you guys agree that Russell is a hermeticist at heart, or in his basic teachings?
I would think of Russell as a three-dimensional alchemist slash hermeticist. In basic alchemy, you have the circle and the square, where Russell was able to transmute that two-dimensional teaching into a three-dimensional cube and sphere, which, you could trace the human mind back a couple thousand years and say that we were entirely two-dimensional in our thinking. Yet, to gain new stratums of awareness, you have to move beyond the conception of matter as being particles and more into the wave nature of creation, which, when you create waves of three dimensionality, you begin to see a concept of the universe unfold that is more in tune with nature. So yeah, the hermeticists of the old days dealt with the square and the circle, but what's so interesting about Russell is he three-dimensionalized the wave. And if you know that science still uses a two-dimensional chalkboard sine wave to try to teach how waves actually move in spirals, you're limited to that two-dimensional surface. So he gives you a way of thinking about matter that is three-dimensional. And it takes a lot of practice. I mean, it's a language in itself, as you said earlier, consciousness or science from the Latin scio means to know. And all these past 2,000 years we've done is try to sense the universe and reason it into a sensible existence. You can't reason love into existence. There's no experiment you can do to prove that, you love your wife or you love your mother, but you can certainly know whether or not you do. And some things are just better known than they are, sensed. And so it takes eons for man's mind to unfold from a limited sense-based perception to a knowing that transcends the senses. But then at the same time, as you learn to know what it is you're dealing with, you become more able and apt to predict or to know what is going to be the outcome. So the need for experimentation is basically excluded at that point. You begin to operate from the fulcrum, which is the power source of the seesaw of your hemispheres of your own body, brain. And in that sense, you achieve that mind spatiality equilibrium where all power is available to you, all knowledge. And so you're moving in a sense into that new paradigm where the knower becomes the producer of sensed effects. So it becomes quite purposeful at that point. And I'd like to comment real quickly too. You mentioned about philosophy, and with the University of Science and Philosophy, I truly do understand why the Russells named it that, is because philosophy is literally the root of science. It was the great existentialists who asked the questions, who am I, why am I here, that led to, the entire scientific method. So you can't just hack off the tree and claim that it's separate from the root. It's the very philosophy of life and the questioners of reality that drove science into existence. So one is actually the embodiment of the other. And as far as Hermeticism goes, yeah, it's Russell's science and philosophy is like a three-dimensional alchemy slash Hermeticism.
Brilliant. Yeah, that's got my head spinning. That's a great answer. Well, yeah, I mean, I appreciate that. I hope more and more people will understand what you just said. Understand that there is a knowing, and that science, you know, is centered in the mind, or in you could say in philosophy, the love of wisdom, and that there is a purpose to it, and the purpose is to balance all people. I think instead of just creating technology that we use for sort of a profit model and destroy the earth and people and our bodies in the process. We should look to science as a way, like the Tao, like a way, the way to know our purpose, the way to center our lives, the way to commune with nature, the way to be, right?
Absolutely. In today's world, so many people seek to give their little bit of power that they have away to some external authority, which is what gives the state its rising tide of power. It seems to want to provide people with zero effort, some reward for no effort at all. And it's, in a sense, it's why the Russells were opposed to communism in every way, shape, and form, because really nature doesn't act on a communist model. It acts on more or less a holarchical. Those things in nature that are purposeful, that do the work required of that individual creation, say a bird or even a fish, if it acts in accord with its design, it lives a purposeful life, and it has lasting continuity throughout its life. Now you have this model of, people can just sit around and get handed things and expect to find happiness from that. It's just not in tune with nature. Nothing in nature doesn't work and still survives. But that's one of the conundrums we find ourselves in terms of politics and what is the best road forward. But just to know enough that nature creates purposeful things that must act in accord with natural law to create balance in the life of that species or that individual life form. Nature's very correct that anything that does not act in accord with its design actually begins to destroy itself. And some could say it should, because
Right.
If a tree leans too far off a cliff, it's going to topple into the chasm, just like man's civilization. If it runs amok and is out of balance, it's going to meet a fateful end. And you can look at the evidence of that. There's been 21 civilizations that have fallen due to imbalanced human relations, either between the haves and the have-nots or some other imbalanced action. And so always the have-nots will want to take from those who have, and that creates the situation for things like communism to rise and become powerful. And again, it's delicate. If we truly understood how nature continues, how it has such continuity, we would base our own civilization off of that. And that's one of the unique aspects of the philosophy of the Russells, the living philosophy, is that they knew the electrifying power of man-woman balance. To assume that a government could run a human home is absurd. To think that a woman could run it all by herself, or that a man could run it all by himself. It takes really two to create balance in nature. And the male and the female of every species does an equal amount of work in some way, shape, or form to assure the continuity of its own self, to reproduce the idea of that self eternally. So we see continuity in nature, but with man trying to be both mother and father to the world, we've seen one civilization fall after another. And it's wise of Leo to say that, if woman were to be the sole power source of the world and try to run the world all by herself, it would end in just as much of a disaster as it would if man himself tried to run the entire world. So we have yet to understand how the balance of male and female plays equally into the continuity of nature. And it's something that will require probably centuries of thinking to understand. But that balance actually begins within each human being, as well as each individual entity of nature. To perform its role as it was designed is to live within continuity and the eternal qualities of the mind source from which it springs.
Wow. Yep. Well said again. I love the term you used in a few times in other your past interviews, where you call that process where man is trying to walk that delicate balance. You call it the human relations pollution, where people are unwillingly and unconsciously polluting themselves by, I would say, by just agreeing with the status quo or the mediocrity of society, of going after what your neighbors say you should go after because they saw it on television or whatnot. And that's really I think what we're getting at. I mean, if the world could actually shift into this type of science, uh, which would be a shift in consciousness, obviously. I mean, there's so many things that could change. I mean, obviously the most basic would be we would no longer be digging up fossil fuels and having an entropy based way of living. But just the centering of things, just the way we could be. I mean, I can't even imagine just so much. We could have everything that we have now. We could have all the technologies that work, that make our lives convenient. But I think it would be brilliant if everyone knew that with those technologies, they have a bit of purpose. They have a bit of responsibility each day in their lives. And what you just said kind of makes me, I have these conversations and I'll talk about something philosophical, and a lot of people go, they go, why do I need to know that? Like, why are you telling me that? They listen to it. They go, that's a nice idea, but how does it affect me in my life? Why do I need to know that? And then they just look down and they go back to their phone. And it's like, if you don't realize that you need to have a centered way of being in the world, and you don't, you need to walk with some sort of purpose, and you need to be able to feel the harmony that exists in nature. I mean, I don't know how to help you if you're not even already aware that there is something beyond you going on here. There's the spirit, if you want to call it that. There's the netters from the Egyptian tradition, the cosmic forces of nature. It's just like, it's so strange to me that it's like people have been really, really turned off. Like our ontology is oftology, like people are just not everybody, but the humdrum of society, the things that just keep us getting up out of bed every day tend to grind our spirituality away. So yeah, I mean, I'm so happy that I found this work. I'm gonna have to study it a lot more to fully understand it, but I think what you guys are doing is necessary and brilliant, and more people should hear about it.
I appreciate that.
Yeah.
Isn't it isn't called the great work of the self without due reason.
Right.
It's the least, it's the path least taken. It's that middle road, where everybody else is on that wide path toward mediocrity. Very few will do the homework or do the work of self-introspection, which is absolutely required to even begin to get on this path. I mean, that's really what it takes. You have to, and sometimes the best way to get on that path is to just smash the bottom as hard as you can. In my own personal life, I had to hit bottom so hard that at that point I contemplated suicide or self-betterment, and I chose self-betterment. But either way, those are kind of good experiences, because if they lead you to a higher purpose, they lead you to try to work on the self, to create yourself, recreate yourself again and again, to learn to unfold the natural talents that lay innate within your character. And it really all comes down to character building. I mean, this is what the Twilight Club, which was the original impetus for Walter and Leo to create the University of Science and Philosophy, was because that club of poets, which included Herbert Spencer, Alexis Carrel, Walt Whitman, Mark Twain, various other luminaries of the fine arts and things like that, they saw that around the change of the 20th century, and some 20 years before when they first met, that human civilization, as it was budding into this industrial age, the character of man was beginning to slip because of everything that was being made easier. You have these machines now doing the work that men used to do by hand, so they felt that in the industrialization, man's soul would become industrialized and lose its sense of purpose and lose its sense of self. And here we are today, looking out and seeing that there's a world of machines that are going to replace humans. We're we're in a spiritual crisis,
Yeah.
honestly.
Yeah.
And all these things that tend to peak around this time, war, disease, are all effects of that crisis. So again, that crisis also helps create the need to solve that problem. And they say necessity is the mother of all invention. Well, there's a certain necessity that you see the spiritual teachings of so many different modalities around the world coming to the forefront now. And so you have these great philosophical debates occurring in podcast after podcast across the planet, where the mainstream, basically or what is the dinosaur media, I would say, is in its final death throes. Nobody's getting anything spiritual out of that anymore, so they're seeking new alternative avenues of information, which are coming to the forefront. And this kind of media will become the new media. It is the new media. It already is, I should say. And I think everyone, I've said this before, everyone should become their own media. And media, the very word, means a form of cultivation, conveyance, or expression. And what is your form of conveyance? What is your culture? What is your expression? Culture isn't just about tradition, it's about recreating the traditions. And so many of us have so many kinds of blood from so many different kinds of places. But what is the real culture? What is it we're trying to create here that betters human society? I think we're in a great time of spiritual introspection, and that's great for the human race. And a lot of good can come from that. So it's important to keep in mind that though the world seems to be on fire and everything seems to be moving toward hell at the same time, there's an equal and opposite of those who are coming to the fruition of what it means to be human, those who are recreating and rebranding and reinvestigating and reorganizing so that we can find ways to work ourselves out of this conundrum. There's an equal impetus for solution as much as there is for recognizing the problem. And that's great to see. It's going to be a hard road, but what road was easy? And if I look back at my own life, the hard times I had made me who I am, and I wouldn't trade them for the world. And I think that, as human beings, we'll appreciate that same hard work that it took to develop the kind of character that can lead us into the real new age, which is a leap in consciousness that takes about 300 years to achieve.
Right. Yeah. If somebody else is creating your culture, then you're not, right? So everyone should be able to. I like that, to be able to take control, or control is maybe not the right word, but to engage in their own selfhood, their own development. And so that kind of leads me to, this is another philosophical question, I know, and then we'll have to ask a more scientific question after this. But you might have already kind of just nailed it, but I wanna bring it out there anyway. Russell had a statement about genius where, basically he would say, like, mediocrity is self-inflicted and genius is self-created. Can you speak on that a little bit? That this idea that each person actually, within them has the ability, or has the potential ability, to be their own genius.
Indeed. The quote was, mediocrity is self-inflicted, genius is self-bestowed.
Yes.
The Russell said over and over in the writings throughout that there are no accidentally great people, that in order to become great, a man or woman has to choose and decide and take actions and make things happen in a series of steps to achieve that greatness. And we look around at the world, and of course the dinosaur media, the old media, likes to tell us that Einstein was great. Every university hallway has a poster of Einstein, but yet what did he actually make in physical reality besides a concrete refrigerator, which never caught on?
Right.
Ultimately, a genius produces a prodigious amount of work. There's attributes to genius. They tend to want to work alone. They prefer not to work in groups because it stifles their creativity, which is another reason why communism will never produce a strain of geniuses, because you can't, out of a mob, garner anything more than destruction, which is why mob rule is a dangerous thing, and it should be relegated to the past in terms of human betterment. But the genius, what's amazing about them is that they're often misunderstood, but they tend to be the progenitors of massive change in the human world. I mean, if you just take Tesla alone and his creations, which elevated the human race into the actual beginnings of the New Age. The New Age was actually called the New Age because of electricity. That's the root of the actual New Age.
Yep.
Not this late 1960s drug using cult of hippies, which everybody's been through the hippie thing, I guess you could say, but that's not the New Age. With people touring at $400 a seminar to get you closer to that's the false New Age, if you will. The New Age is the age of electricity. It was when man lit the night sky and drove terror away from his cities and his homes with light. So we brought light to the world, the new age of electricity. And it sort of got stifled. I mean, we were hit, blindsided, by the J.P. Morgans and the Rockefellers and the so-called the banking, the Rothschilds and all that stuff. That's all to stifle and funnel man's talents and efforts into somebody's pocketbook. So we're coming to the end of that paradigm, but it's important that as we move forward, we don't lose sight of working on what is really important, and that's the expression of yourself, your true purpose. And the Russells really felt with their teaching the home study course, which is the flagship curriculum of the USP, the purpose of it was to help you unfold your innate talents through the discovery of yourself, which is, the creator within you, to learn to take from the stillness and the silence and the equilibrium within yourself the inspiration that comes to be able to create bodies and create purposeful living for yourself, to achieve, the genius within, to unfold it. So it's more or less a study course of how to do exactly that, to unfold the genius within you and to give it to the world for the betterment of all humanity.
Wow, thank you. Yeah, the word genius, there's a lot of roots to it, but for me, it mostly refers to gender or to generate, that constant round and around and around movement in nature of progress. And in this case, the progress that you so eloquently just described, the progress of consciousness. I'm not a big fan of Einstein, and I totally agree with you. But I think he had maybe one moment of genius, and it's encapsulated in this quote. So I'm going to read it. This is a quote from Albert Einstein. You can imagine that I look back at my life's work with calm satisfaction, but from nearby it looks quite different. There is not a single concept of which I am convinced that it will stand firm, and I feel uncertain whether I am in general on the right track. So there's Albert Einstein, in his moment of maybe honesty and centered genius, where he goes, everything I've done is potentially wrong and probably wrong, and yet he's still propped up as our greatest scientist, or one of our greatest scientists, our greatest physicists. And I think it's just a shame and a sham that not to deface him as a person, but to deface the establishment for just using him as a profit generator, like you said.
And that's well said. And two, if you look like the Alfred Whiteheads and others who were the progenitors of the current science movement of materialism, all in their papers, the Heideggers and Schrodinger, admitted at the end of their cursory examination of materiality that, there's something that's creating this that's even beyond their perception. So they hinted and alluded that basically everything they had helped to solidify in terms of materialistic science was unfounded and needed more examination, that there's a universal power source or mind, if you will, that's all pervading, that creates this. But yet the powers that never were ran with the materialism story because it serves them to externalize the human soul, to want to chase things outside of itself. And that could be any of the seven deadly sins, down to people lining up at a Walmart at 5 a.m. to stomp each other to death on a Black Friday. So yeah, I mean, it's imperative too that we recognize that we've been sold only part of the actuality of what's really going on, and that is to look outside of yourself. Everything is geared toward the bells and the whistles and the loud noises and the distractions and the commercials and the shows and the programs and the programming. But it's so enlightening and comforting to have, a media that's coming into existence to replace what is false. At least people are out there questioning and willing to take a second look at things, just like the science of materialism, which so many people now, compared to just 5 years ago, there's thousands, perhaps millions more people questioning that paradigm. And that's what leads to new discoveries, is when you question, when you go, I wonder if what they're saying is right anymore. And it's that, that very foundation of trying to, find a better interpretation, or at least try to interpret it for yourself.
Right.
That's what, who says we're done experimenting? Who says we're done, with testing new concepts? And it is indeed a concept that creates a body, whether it be a piece of art, a painting, a poem, a symphony, a rock song, a jazz tune. That concept is unfolded through the action of thinking, but the concept itself has no body and is lifeless. And everybody has great concepts all throughout their life. It's just the difference between genius and mediocrity is genius takes the chance and builds the body for it. That's really all it is. It's a simple choice.
I have to agree with that. And would you say that pretty much all geniuses have a deep self-actualization and self-awareness, or just a sense of knowing?
That's all part and parcel to the exercise of self-actualization, is you learn to listen to the voice of God within you, which is that still small voice. And that's the beauty of these teachings as well. They help inform you as to how to listen to that voice and how to employ its usefulness in day-to-day living.
And then you have all the science. Really, for me, has been about how do you do something which is relegated as impossibility, but is in fact very possible. It's just you have to work with nature rather than trying to dominate it with make your model fit what nature's doing. And it doesn't work that way.
Right.
You have to work with nature. You have to realize you're a part of it. It's something that is you. You can't take an organism out of its environment and expect it to act naturally anymore. And we're the same way. We've invented our own habitat, and it contributes to that spiritual crisis that Matt was talking about. We're trying to make sense of this world that we've made, and we're the ones who's responsible for it.
Yeah, our antipathy to nature is like the source of all of our neurosis, I believe. And I was wondering, that reminds me, have you ever heard of that guy Sadhguru? Have you ever heard of him?
Sounds familiar.
He's a mystic from India, but he doesn't claim any religion. He doesn't claim Hinduism or any other religion, but he's pretty bright, and he had this talk that was so good about. It's on YouTube somewhere. It's basically called like a scientist versus a mystic.
Mm-hmm.
And he just, like, for an hour, he just politely just destroys the scientist, and
it's not that hard to do, but you're not.
I mean, it's really good. Like, it's brilliant the way he does it, and I've sent it out to a lot of people, very scientifically minded people, and it's weird. They don't like it. They don't know what to say.
I like what Matt says, or actually it was his wife Lori said, that you have to plant seeds, not forests. In other words, you can't shove an entirely new cosmology into someone's head just by using words in a 15-minute amount of time. it really does take a lot of work, and you have to really want to learn it. If you crack open Atomic Suicide and you can't put it down and you just say, I got to just read all of this, then you're in the right state of mind to really be willing to let go of old concepts that don't really have any relation to nature at all.
This is the end of part 1. Please continue on to part 2. Thank you. Welcome back, everyone, to Still Point Radio. This is part 2 of Creation Mechanics, Optic and Electric Universe, Russellian Science with Matt Presti and Darren Colomb. We're going to continue on and talk about math, mass, gravity, thank you, magnetic cones, the center of planets and stars, pressure conditions, and more. Here we go. Enjoy. So Darren, I wanted to ask you this question that constantly comes up for me, and I have a very difficult time answering it, honestly. People are constantly asking me this one question. Whenever I post a video on Russellian Science, the work of Walter Russell, or anything in the physics paradigm that has to do with the electric universe model, someone inevitably chimes in and goes, well, where's the math? Show me the math. And it's as if they're programmed and trained that if you don't give them that little cookie or that biscuit of math, then it's unacceptable and it doesn't exist. So I wanted to just put that question to you. If someone says, I did a video out there that got a lot of hits. It was like, how do you weigh a floating planet? So this is going to be a 2-question question. How do you actually weigh a floating planet? How do we actually get the weight of something that is floating in space, and we can't put it on a scale? So there's the second part of the question. And the first part of the question is, if you're going to talk about something like this in the Russellian Science model, and someone says, okay, well, now you've told me how to weigh a floating planet, where's the language to prove it? Where's the math? How would you respond to that, Darren?
Well, yeah, this is a fundamental in science. We have to render everything down to mathematics, and if it doesn't render to mathematics, it can't possibly be true. And that's the way it goes. That's the way it's taught, and it's just a way of thinking. When it comes to Russell science, there's an entire chapter in the Universal One on universal mathematics. Maybe it's missed because it's not quite. It has to do with ratios. In other words, it's all geometric. Russell science is about geometry, not about putting every aspect of motion down into some kind of formula with constants, right? There's always constants in everything because there's no other way to get any kind of relationship other than by something which is a constant, which is another way of saying a fulcrum, right? So, for instance, just as an example, E equals mc squared, C would be the constant, and you have a relationship between mass and energy now, right? But it's a relationship which is made up because of the constant, something which is a set value and never changes. So Russell science is about geometry. If you want the math, then you have to look at it from a geometric point of view, because everything which is formed has to be preconceived into some form of a scaffolding. That's what the cubic wave field model is. When you have motion bounded within, say, 6 walls of a mirror, now you have a massively complicated geometric form because you have repetition at orthogonal angles. It gets a bit complicated, but it's very well put down by Russell in Universal One on the chapter Universal Mathematics. And also a member of our Science and Research Committee, Hannah, she is excels at the mathematics and the geometric formations of the cube wave field model. She's been working on the math because, just as you pointed out, there are people who will never accept it without the math behind it. And I would say that really a large aspect of the sciences has nothing really to do with mathematics, because how can you use math to describe your soul or your mind, even for that matter?
Right.
So math is a language. Math is a language just like English is a language. There's no difference. It's just you even have to go through and learn all these letters to know what a statement really means. So I use mathematics. It's extremely useful because you can get proportionalities. It's a ratio. All mathematics is relationships. That's how I think of it. Now, your second question, how do you weigh a weightless planet? Well, it doesn't have any weight, so you don't weigh it. Weight is a relationship between a mass and a center of gravity. So relative to a center of gravity, a planet doesn't have any weight at all. It's in its potential zone. Take any planet you like in relation to our sun in our solar system. Our sun produced every single planet. It gave it off at its equator, and now it moves outward. When it finds its potential zone that matches its potential. Everything in this universe moves to seek its own pressure potential. So that's why Mercury is a rock solid planet, but it's very, very close to the sun. And Earth is also terrestrial. It's a rock solid, but it has on its crust now liquid water. And it has that because of its potential pressure zone, let's say, relative to the sun and its own angle of inclination and the way it dips above and below the solar equator. So nothing moves in the universe except to find its own pressure potential. But once it does, it no longer has any weight. A rock on the surface of the planet doesn't really have any weight because now it's found an equalized pressure condition and it equalizes. It no longer has weight. Weight is really a measure of how out of balance you are. That's all it is.
Right. That's the most interesting, the last statement there. The weight is actually the measure of how out of balance you are. Most people, that's an apophatic approach. That's a deconstructing of what most people think. Well said and brilliant. So technically, just so I have it correct, you can't weigh a weight. Well, you can't weigh, I said, a floating planet, but the reason why you can't weigh a floating planet is because it's actually imbalance. The only way you would be able to detect the quote unquote weight of a planet is if it falls out of balance somehow, and that's impossible. The whole thing is spinning on its axis and potentially orbiting in these brilliant harmonic patterns of a vortex cone. So it's always balanced. Is that fair to say?
Right. The only way the planet would have weight is if you somehow were able to remove it from its orbit and either bring it closer or farther away from the sun. Now it would have an elastic measure of imbalance, and you would be able to measure that if you had, sufficient instruments. But it works the same way for your own body, because your own body is a compressed mass. And so if you were to dig a ditch, you would find that you weigh more in a ditch than if you climbed up to the top of a mountain, because you've changed your relationship between your own mass and the center of gravity in the earth. Your own body is always an extension of the planet, and a planet is the extension of a sun. This is how it works. Bodies come together, male, female, and they produce more male and female bodies.
Yep. Okay. So you mentioned the center of gravity. There's quite a bit of talk out there as to what is gravity, and since we know that the universe is actually not particulates, it's not moving around in little balls called atoms, but it's moving around in waves, then can you talk about what modern science calls gravity, and can you define it in terms of what would Russell would say, and should we even use that word, or should we just redefine it, or should we come up with an entirely new word for that principle in the universe?
I think we should use Russell's definition of gravity because he had a much deeper understanding of how gravity relates to everything. Gravity, in many ways, is really the only force in the universe. But in some instances, he would say that electricity is the only force in the universe, because electricity is really a strain or a tension from separating from unity. In other words, when you take an elastic rubber band, it's inert, it's in a state of equilibrium, but when you stretch it, you give it a dynamic tension. And the reaction, the elastic reaction to go back to equilibrium, is part and parcel now. So really, you only need one force in the universe to create seemingly two different forces, one away from equilibrium and one toward equilibrium. In either case, that's exactly what gravity is, except it works now in 3 dimensions, you see. So they have a very modern science's understanding of gravity has everything to do with Newton and Newton's law of matter attracting other matter. But nothing, as I said before, moves to because of attraction or repulsion. It moves to find an equalized pressure or an equilibrium. Everything is trying to get back to equilibrium. So really the only force is the one which divides any equilibrium into 2 polarized extensions. And that is what gravity is. For instance, the gravity center of the Earth, for example, they say the Earth is a magnet. Well, if the Earth was a magnet and we have a North Pole up here in the northern hemisphere and a South Pole down in the southern hemisphere, then the middle of the Earth would be completely inert. You can't make anything stick to the middle of a bar magnet.
Uh-huh.
So you wouldn't be able to stand on the Earth if it were inert at the center. So really, the Earth, just like every other sphere which is created, is done so by conical magnets in pairs. Everything works in pairs, male and female. They work together and they construct and deconstruct this entire universe of optical illusion.
Okay, and so you mentioned optical illusion, and that was another one of my questions. Well, basically, there was in your last talk that I was listening to at the USP, you were describing the universe in terms of optics instead of gravity, so to speak, or instead of I guess what I'm getting at is, like, people will say, well, gravity bends light, but technically it's not gravity that's bending light, right? It's something different. It's an optical based universe. So can you talk about that?
Well, you get lenses bend light, and lenses are always gravity centered. In other words, you have basically rings. Rings are where spheres are sections of spheres, and lenses are where spheres intersect one another. And now when they intersect, you get that sort of two-dimensionally, you would call it a vesica Pisces, where you have that sort of biconvex lens formation. That's actually what divides and multiplies the potential of gravity. So it's always projected back to the center. So every mass has a center of gravity, because every mass is made from the multiple collisions of multiple waves at various harmonics. And these create hundreds, if not millions, of different types of lenses within every wave field. But it's always under the control of gravity. Gravity, in many ways, you can think of as being mind. Mind is sort of the ultimate organizer of all of this stuff. And that is as much has to do with gravity as in a physical sense as it does with your own mind, which motivates you and centers your own physical body.
Okay, so are you familiar with the ferrocell?
Absolutely, I have one.
Okay, cool. So this is kind of new to me, but I've been watching some of the videos out there about the ferrocell, and you can clearly see the what I call electric lines. I think, I mean, maybe that's the incorrect word, but you can see these lines, what you're describing, coming off in perfect geometric patterns due to an actual magnet. Usually you see these lines when someone puts a magnet under the cell, different types of magnets, clearly showing without a doubt what's going on in nature. So so those lines you're talking about, those would not be lines of gravity, right? The thing that's sustaining the whole image would be what you're considering gravity, or is that correct?
So I think you're referring to magnetic lines of force, the curved lines around a bar magnet, for example.
Yes.
You can see these with either iron filings or the ferrocell is really good. The ferrocell actually is really proving that this is optics, because it's polarizing LEDs, isn't it? You have LEDs arranged in a circle, and then you have a type of a cell which bends in the presence of a magnet, which means that the condition of the magnet is really a polarized one. You've separated one condition and you've made strains and tensions. When you make strains and tensions, now you make spherical intersections, which give you lenses, which bend. They bend radii. The magnetic lines of force, as described by modern science, are really nothing other than radii of spheres, because nothing in nature is created other than spheres and cubes. That's all there is. They're just in various pressure conditions relative to the amount of polarization that's held within the magnet. When you start using these magnets in pairs, you start getting the conditions that we would conventionally call gravity. When two magnets are used in certain configurations, you can produce the effect of everything moving toward one center, which is what we experience here on this spherical planet of ours.
Okay, but so those magnets, though, what you said earlier, would have to be conical shaped. Is that correct?
Yes, Russell points out that every magnet in nature is actually conical, in that you have a wide base out in space and a more compressed condition at what he called the anode, or the apex of the cone. And these two work together to produce that radial direction inward from every spherical angle.
Okay.
It's a bit hard to describe with words.
Yeah. So if I'm getting this correctly, when someone asks me, and you already answered this question, but when someone asks me, well, where's the math? Where's the math? I typically go, well, it's vortex math. Look at, number 9, the sacred number 9, the 9 number of completion, encoding the spiral, and or really in 3 dimensions a vortex cone. So would it be safe to say that in general terms, that's true, that vortex mathematics is an accurate description of what you're talking about?
Well, I don't endorse any one particular, set of mathematics, but really what it comes down to is that everything which is extended in motion and time eventually is voided back into zero. So the universe never actually exceeds zero. In other words, you could describe the universe with mathematics till you're blue in the face, but you always will have to sum it back to zero. So,
brilliant.
So you can use math to describe motion, but to get the full story, to really realize that the motion couldn't have existed without coming out of a zero condition, and that it must return to that zero condition, just as everything which is born must die to be reborn yet again. What we're dealing with is continual cycles that go infinitely long, because infinity is kind of like zero, isn't it?
Yeah. Yes, it is. So time cannot exist without eternity, and that sort of thing.
Time cannot exist without eternity. Well, time cannot exist without motion. Motion gives you repetitive sequences, and when you ignore, as I said before, when you ignore half of that cycle, then you get continuity, because now you see things grow preponderantly for one half of the cycle and decay in the second half of the cycle. And then, but we don't necessarily see that, for example, human lives, it's not readily apparent that they repeat themselves, but they do repeat themselves. It's just that their time intervals are now on a much a larger scale, and we can't really comprehend them, just like we can't really comprehend how long the sun's life cycle is. It's so extremely long compared to our short lifespans that it's a bit inconceivable. And this is what's happening in nature all the time. There's time cycles within time cycles.
Okay. It's a lot. It's a lot to think about. Thank you for that question. I mean, for that answer. Okay, let me see if I can sort of shift gears. And I don't know. I actually don't know how to articulate this question, but I wanted to talk to you a little bit about color and incandescence following different patterns of density. I heard you mention that earlier, and it makes me think of the work of Goethe, who was sort of had a whole different approach to light moving through a prism than Isaac Newton did. And the more I study Goethe, I tend to agree with his approach. And I don't know if you've looked into Goethe, but I'll simply say this, that there's the basic experiment where he's shining light onto a cone, and he's using different colors of light, white light and then green light and then blue light and red light. And we see when, for example, when a green light is shined on a cone, the shadow the cone makes, when there's green light from both sides, the shadow that the cone makes is this purple color. So you're looking at a shadow that would normally be dark or gray with white light, or with a combination of white light and green light. But when you just do green light, the shadow is now clearly like purple. And modern science, everyone can actually see this with their real eyes. They can perceive this. You could stand in the room and you could see clearly this is purple. But modern science has no instrumentation that, as far as I know, that measures that light wavelength of purple. And so they basically just ignore it, or say that it's not happening, or that it doesn't exist. So I know you mentioned incandescence and the way color, follows patterns of density. I don't know if you don't have to relate that to Goethe, but that's just what I did. Can you just talk about that?
Sure. I'm familiar with Goethe and his experiments, and in a lot of ways it's really good for transitioning into thinking about polarized light. Because what it really means is, the significance of it is that polarization means that there's two things going on rather than one. And that's, if any scientist can make that jump to think about that there's actually two things happening rather than just one thing to create what you're experiencing, then a lot of this starts to make sense, and a lot of it you'll be able to answer on your own. But incandescence is sort of, I think of it like a short circuit. It's what happens when two waves collide with one another, and they produce maximum heat and maximum density. So the sun kind of looks yellow to us, but it's really incandescence, which is sort of almost white or colorless. It is the simulation. The important thing to realize is it's the simulation of the magnetic white light of mind in motion. Just as stability is an illusion of motion. When you look at a solid rock, you know that it appears solid to your senses, but to someone who knows the motion which is creating that rock, realizes that there's a massive amount of potential in that rock, and it's really frozen light, frozen in one condition. But it is as much incandescent as anything else, which is that dense. So the color spectrum is what happens when you divide the invisible magnetic light of mind into polarized light, which is now compressed into a condition of higher density, and then it radiates, because the gravitation is equal to the radiation, and we see it. When it's heavily gravitated, it's heavily radiated, and we see this with our eyes, and we feel it even with our bodies. We feel the sensation of heat, right? When you put your hand near a light bulb, an incandescent light bulb, you can feel the radiating field of heat that comes off of it in all spherical directions. And this is what light is doing. It's dividing itself to multiply. It divides first and then multiplies into incandescence. And every state of motion is really a various state of, you could say, color or just polarized light.
Wow. Okay. Wow. Brilliant. Okay, so that leads me to the question, and uh, in order for us to see or experience light, there has to be the contrast of darkness. So, I mean, it's kind of a vague question, but like, what is darkness? Is darkness just light that it's unperceptible to us, or is it something different?
Yeah, they state the Russell state in the home study course that darkness is another way God gave man to divide his universe. In other words, when your senses look into space, we register it as nothing. But you know that, for example, when you walk around, you're actually in a fluid. You're in a fluid called the atmosphere.
Mm-hmm.
But it's completely invisible because it's beyond your range of being able to sense its vibratory motion. It's too tenuous, if I can use that word, meaning it's diffuse. It's no longer compressed into a solid condition, which your electrical senses can determine as something hard. It's when it becomes expanded and it occupies a larger volume. Now you register it as basically nothing or negative space in that sense. But it's not nothing. It's actually just full of elements that are way beyond our sense of detection. We cannot detect when the wavelength is that long. It's well beyond our ability to see or even feel it, but it has to be there. It's one way for us to exist and experience the things that we do.
Okay, and so I would assume that in all the true wisdom traditions, this is a more philosophical question, but in all the true wisdom traditions that have not been corrupted and prophetized by a hierarchy of priesthoods, I think it's fair to say that all those traditions are really trying to teach mankind how to unlock his access and ability to perceive the infinite wave or infinity. So if that's true, someone like Russell is what we would call a true illuminary. Would you say that he and other great minds and great beings have been able to perceive and see deeper into that wave, like beyond? Obviously it's beyond like the average man's consciousness to be able to come up with this kind of stuff. I know he's not the first, but would you say that man has the potential, infinite potential, like we can potentially perceive boundlessness?
Oh, absolutely. I think that's one of the biggest points of their work, is to realize that you're capable of far more than you think you are, and that your limitations are set by yourself. And they're there. Everything is good. Everything is good in the sense that it all leads to, let's say, self-development. So limitations are good because it means it gives you something to overcome. And when we talk about the limitation of our senses, Walter was somebody who in many ways transcended that limitation. He was able to see the whole 360 degrees of polarized light rather than the tiny little sliver that our eyes are privy to on a day-to-day basis. And he even discusses during his 39-day illumination being able to see people's auras through a solid door that would approach to knock on his door. And he could see this for basically his entire field of vision. And what's fun that it was actually quite annoying to him, because he was trying very desperately to write the message of the Divine Iliad, and this being able to see so many forms of color that we don't even have names for, because we haven't charted their wavelengths or their frequencies on the color spectrum. It was actually kind of annoying for him. He was trying to get work done and being able to. But when you're in that state, that condition, the same one he was in, you fully realize all of the limitations that your senses are subjected to. And so he's, as he said, he was taken behind the scenes of God's universe and was taught that same thing, the creation mechanics. and since he was an artist, when he regained his sensation, he was able to very accurately put this down into art form, into paintings. And the best way I can say is, I can recommend that you get maybe just an idea of what his experience was, is to look at the painting that he called The Wave. He painted basically a three-dimensional wave moving structure on a two-dimensional canvas. Mm-hmm. And by studying this and some of his charts, you can really start to begin to realize the significance of the experience he had, because he was basically no longer subjected to any kind of limitation of senses.
Wow. Yeah, that's amazing. I mean, you hear about that, or you can read about that in from many different traditions, many different perspectives. But Russell's ability to put it down and to articulate it is amazing, and as well as his ability to balance the metaphysical and or philosophical language with, the scientific language, with the language of the earth here, in the present form. It's brilliant.
Right. And they would often, one of their writings that is really something that sticks out was one of my favorite quotes. They said, our work is metascientific as opposed to metaphysical. The difference is great. And meaning they had gotten offers from so many people, from the Edward Casey Foundation to psychics to channelers, and they refused all of them. They did not want to carry that kind of work at the university. They would point you to other works as opposed to those kind of new age things. They would point to more metascientific teachings, like the incredible study done by Dr. Richard Maurice Buck in the book called Cosmic Consciousness, where he studied the cases of 40-some people who exhibited all the traits of classical divine illumination and helped to quantify the experience as one that is measurable. It's the least known, the least talked about of all human experiences, but no less, all these great luminaries brought new knowledge to the entire human race through those experiences. I mean, they started religions, for Christ's sake, but it's always the followers who screw that up. It's not the original people who founded or started or brought you the new knowledge. It's the followers and what they do with it. I mean, even here at the University of Science and Philosophy, there's been disputes between past administrations and student bodies and things like that. But again, I think we get sometimes high and mighty in our efforts to approach knowledge and to be the holders of the keys of it and decide how it should be disseminated, when knowledge is like art. I mean, it's something to be left alone and pay. That's how you pay the most respect to it. Because the minute you change something, for instance, the Mona Lisa, what if a commission of people in, 5 years from now get together and decide that they're going to remove certain paint strokes from the Mona Lisa? Which ones would you remove? Mm-hmm. Which ones would you change to suit the cultural norms of the day or the morality of the people? Moral meaning ways of the people, the mores. And that's what's dangerous about messing with anybody's writings, anybody's art, because if you truly respect knowledge, you'll leave it alone and let every human come to it on their own, because if the knowledge doesn't change, then it's timeless. It has its quality that emerged from stillness, gave it its impetus to attract people to it, but it retains its timeless quality by respecting it for what it is. That's why great art, like the David statue by Michelangelo, has retained such importance. If some sculptor would have come along 200 years later and gone, oh, we can't show the private parts or the naked body, let's carve up the statue to make it look like he has clothes on, it would be an absolute disaster. You have to just basically look at knowledge in the naked eye for what it is, leave it alone, respect it. And that's one of our missions here at the USP, is just to leave the work alone, but help it to secure a foundation so that it lasts well into the future. It's one of the goals of our committees are to just, find a way to raise money to where we can get a new museum to put the artwork back out on display, because the art is the living philosophy embodied. I mean, it's the proof that the philosophy holds water, because unlike Einstein, who said, I have this philosophy called math, but yet had no bodies to demonstrate its existence beyond a few numerical characters. With the Russell Science and Philosophy, you can see 36 tons of artwork and sculpture as living proof that this philosophy has, credence.
Yeah, that's brilliant. I mean, to be able to have that, to be in the position that you're in, and to understand and respect the knowledge, and instead of try to change it, to hold it as it is, leave it alone, is an extremely high level of conscientiousness. And I agree with you. I'm coming to this knowledge.
And yeah, just like,
go ahead.
Say, just like if you should write a song, Ryan, and 100 years from now, some guy comes along and goes, well, I don't like that guitar lead, I'm going to change the whole thing. Then you've just completely ruined the original intent of that author, creator, musician, poet, philosopher, whatever. So that's why it's important, to garner a respect for the work, especially giants like Russell. I mean, he's, as Michael Tessarian said in a recent interview, his name should be shouted from the mountaintops. He's one of these giants of humanity whose work has added a great deal, a great gift, of a great treasure to the rest of the human race. And, to think about the inhalation process of nature, which is really the missing piece here in science. I mean, they've given us a pretty full-on explanation of exhalation in the universe, but absolutely no even hint of an inhalation process to matter. And they can describe the effects of the tornado as it blows down homes, but they can't describe how it's formed. They completely miss the inhalation process. And with gifts like this that come to the human race, often the illuminate will make known what was previously unknown. And that's really the beauty of the science, I think, which is a living embodiment of the philosophy. And the philosophy is the living embodiment of the science. You can't have one without the other, just like the root and then the tree.
I'm a big fan of Michael Tessarian. I've been following his work for a long time. And I saw that interview with you and David Whitehead. I loved it. Really, really good work. So, yeah, shout out to him. But yes, I mean, you're absolutely correct. And I don't know much more to say other than yes. yes. About the home study course, I mean, I think, how can people get a hold of this information? I mean, anybody can go buy a book on Amazon and go buy the works of Walter Russell. I myself have gone through The Secret of Light about 1.5 times, and it just enthralls me. It's a super dense, study. It puts me into a very meditative, contemplative state. That's how I know that I'm actually growing and learning. But for others out there that are listening to this podcast and listening to this, what's the home study course about, and also what's the best way for people to get more in contact with the works of Walter Russell?
Well, certainly the website, philosophy.org, and click on the store, and you can find links to pretty much all kinds of things: books, booklets, home study course. We offer the 3rd edition as a Kindle ebook. There are many ebooks for people who prefer that platform. And I must say, I know I'm well aware of all the free PDFs floating around there, but the impetus to purchase the physical copies, obviously, there's so much writing on the fact that the university is a 501c3 not-for-profit, and its very existence and all the sales of books, donations help to fulfill the goals of finding a new place for the artwork. We are doing science and research, which is taking a dramatic acceleration with Darren being part of this. I mean, he's basically sacrificed his income to pursue this, and he's doing some amazing things, which we'll put into video form and present to the world in time very shortly. And as far as the home study course, the benefits of the home study course, what is it? It's a course in cosmic consciousness, more or less. It teaches fundamentally universal law, which is the law of balance. It teaches the living philosophy, which is the approach to being a great creator or unfolding your genius, which all of us possess. And then it teaches natural science, which is the mechanics behind nature, the cubic wave field model. And you can also see basically a even more intense conglomeration of all those lessons put into the book Atomic Suicide, which is the final distillation of the science. It's one of the most beautifully written books they ever did. There's major changes between, well, some significant changes, I'll say that, between that and the Universal One. The Universal One is considered his magnum opus by a lot of people, though it was his first attempt at giving you his scientific principles and concepts, where Atomic Suicide is really 40 years of maturation and much retrospection on his own definitions of words like gravity, things like that. For instance, one of the chapters in Atomic Suicide, page 106, I think it's chapter 3, is called "We Define God." And that to me is, every scientist should read that before he relegates the idea of God to some dustbin of history somewhere. And we really are operating in terms of terms itself on a Windows 93 kind of operating system. We really need to upgrade our definition of the entire idea of divinity, of spirit, and how much it plays a part in the role of man. Again, being materialistically minded, we've reduced mind itself to a function of the brain, where clearly there's a million near-death experiences and probably several thousand illumination experiences that almost conclusively prove that mind is not an effect, but rather the cause. That rather it's more of an idea of the creator itself, as opposed to a condition of matter or some emergent faculty from an entropic Big Bang of some sort. So yeah, it's basically the ideas that the Russells offer and what they teach in the home study course and many of the books at philosophy.org are, again, meta-scientific principles as opposed to metaphysical. And it's basically is a blueprint for unfolding more of a cosmically minded awareness that you can use in your daily life to fulfill your purpose and to help to uplift humanity as a whole.
Perfect. Wow. Yeah, in my some of the things you said there just sort of ring true. My latest interview is with a Native American Sundance leader, Lee Plennywolf from Pine Ridge, and I was really trying to probe him for all this spiritual experience, this what we maybe would call paranormal or beyond the senses experience, when I was talking to him, because I know him pretty well. We're close. I practice ceremony with him, and he just kept drawing me away from it. And he's like, this interview is not about my personal, illuminations, my personal experiences. He's like, all I really want to teach are the 7 Lakota life values. And I won't go through all of those, but the reason why I'm saying this is that, the first Lakota life value is creator first. It's like you have to acknowledge that there's something going on here that's, one, mysterious, and one, beyond you, right? So he's like,
absolutely.
The very first thing is, walk your life and acknowledge there's a creator. There's a great creator first. And I think you've said this many times in your past interviews, is that science's biggest misnomer is their original jumping off point. their approach to reality is just wrong, because they're ignoring the quite literally the largest thing in the universe, which is God or the Creator or Spirit.
And that's well said. I mean, every motif, you can see this motif running throughout the Native American traditions. You can go to the Vikings, and you can go to the Visigoths, you can go to the Romans, the Greeks, the Sumerians, tribal elders in Africa, the shaman of the world, and they all basically say the same thing. They acknowledge the divine. You know, that's a common motif that runs through all of India, all of even Chinese, you know, ancient modalities. Basically, what you see with science is again a removal of the creator, a denial of the spirit. And so matter must now take the place of spirit to define material. And this is how they've come up with the ludicrous idea that there's this God particle, when the actual God particle is all around us. It's the most plentiful substance in the universe. It's called carbon. That is, in Russell science, the perfect balance between sphere and cube. Whereas all elements, which are basically, for one, there's one element, it's carbon. All is either trying to become carbon or is carbon unbecoming. But carbon is the balance of the wave of creation, especially in Russell science. And so it has the most bonding, the most chemical bonds, 10 million and counting that we know of. It's the most plentiful element in the world and the universe, as far as we know. It's also the hardest substance with the highest melting point. The diamond is its crystal, which symbolizes eternal union for marriage ceremonies. It's no accident that's why they use the diamond to express love, which is the ultimate, you know, expression of creation and creator itself. And it's something we could look at hard and realize that there's a reason for this. And so all elements before and beyond carbon are distorted cubes, which, you know, are why they're transient in their qualities, more or less. But nonetheless, in terms of the spiritual aspects and why science uses matter to try to define matter, which, again, a particle, you can't even, what a particle of what? What is it a part of? How can a particle be used to describe another particle?
Right.
Again, it's like saying the left side of the seesaw is responsible for the right side's motion, but yet any numbskull can look at the center of the seesaw and see that fulcrum there that doesn't move. You know, and that's one thing science can't see, so yet they deny it exists. It's not just I can't see it or I don't know it's there. It's that, no, that doesn't exist. It must be something in the seesaw, the plank of wood itself. Let's look at this particle of the wood and try to use that to describe the motion of the wood. Well, that kind of approach is failing. I mean, there's no, it leaves you with all these disproportionate theories that they're trying to marry together. You have, 100 different explanations, from string theory to the 500th Planck, all the way down to quantum this and quantum that, and somewhere they're trying to marry all these disproportionate theories together to create one big grand unified theory. Well, less is more. The simplest explanation is always the truest. And I have not encountered a model yet that's simpler than the cubic wave field model and more explanatory in the effects of motion, because I myself know that even at the center of myself, when I calm myself from an emotional, back and forth, I can think more clearly. I mean, you don't have clear thoughts in horizontal thinking. You're stuck on the seesaw. But when you become vertical, when you think vertically like the great geniuses do, you complete the cross and you can access the totality of your being to bring into existence new ways, new approaches, solutions, if you will. They don't call it a solution for nothing. I mean, you're bringing it down where it never existed into being. And so you're learning to manifest creative principles within your own life that, how can you fix somebody else if you can't even fix yourself? That's, again, the great self-work is what all this philosophy is here to do. The science is the act of acting out your concepts into physical form. There's a very real process to that, and I think it's what makes their work some of the greatest work out there. It's inspirational. I would advise everybody to take your own time and start with one of the books, start with the booklet. I guarantee you'll find inspiration in it, and it's that's the real attractor. That's what brought me more and more into the work, is that it was just one constant inspiration after another. And I don't claim to have been all that greatly well read, but everything I have read, I've never encountered any kind of material before or since that leaves one so inspired, which just creates the will and the desire to absorb more. And it's been a magical journey.
Well said. Brilliant. Yeah, there's no doubt when I've read of Walter Russell, it truly inspires me. I mean, it's brilliant. It's obviously, I mean, it's kind of beyond words, you can just say all these great things. Wonderful, brilliant, illuminating, all that. It's all there. I know I have a lot more study to do. But I feel that inspiration as well, that spiral within,
Absolutely.
And
it's also cult proof. That's the beauty. It's like wearing a bulletproof vest in the new age of fakery. You're one determiner for whether something is a cult or not a cult. Is there's always in a cult an external thing to follow. In the entire Russell philosophy, they point the finger straight at you and say you're the only thing to follow. And you have to figure out what you are here to do. But here's a basic guide in the home study course of how Walter Russell was able to achieve 36 tons of sculpting, architecture. Well, architecture is an entirely different weight. There's several buildings in New York that are still standing today, but painting, poetry, sculpting, his philosophy, his music are all, evidence of what he claims or what he teaches and what they teach together in this home study course. That's the embodiment of the philosophy standing before thee, which again, it's just it's really about you. It makes total sense when you understand that the lever or the volume knob of desire is yours to turn up or down. Mediocrity is happy with the volume being set on 1. That's fine. But a genius, they crank that volume knob up. They turn it up as high as they can. And that's what makes a man more prodigious in his creative abilities than others, is because they want to be creative. There are no accidentally great people, once again, as the Russell said time and time again.
Yeah, and I would echo that. I would just say that there's moments right now around the world where there's this dystopia happening, where people are falling into some sort of doom, because if you're watching television every day, it's a constant loop or drip of fragmented psychology and gloom and doom. And I gotta say, I don't own a television, but still I read a lot, and when I read Russell, man, I sink into that. I sink into that that inspiration. So I know there's something there for me, and that's why I'm so happy to interview you guys and help spread the word. I think you guys are doing amazing work. Darren, you got the science down. I know you could answer any physicist out there with an articulate, well thought out and sound answer. And Matt, the same with you. Your philosophy is the same, centered and sound. And so if there's anything else that any other topics or anything else you guys would like to add, feel free. The floor is yours. Otherwise, I'll probably start to wind it down, and then, I'd like to pick it up again someplace at some point in the future once I go through all this. And there's so many jumping off points here. We could do other shows, on much of this stuff.
Yeah, I would just say, maybe as a final thought, that cultivate a fascination with the mysterious. That when I think about it, how I got to where I am now is really only because I followed my interests. I followed my passions. And I think if something I can do, if I can create something, invent something that gives people more free time, then that means that they have more free time for self-development and self-introspection. And that's probably the greatest thing that we can do for each other, is just give everybody a sort of a clear path as to what is really important in your life. And you need the time and the energy to really be able to sit down and focus on that. And follow your passion. That's really the only thing to do. And nothing in your life will make sense really until you really get that, you know. And then everything will make sense, and you won't be fighting things that don't serve you.
Anything else, Matt? Anything you'd like to add, or?
Well, just like to point people, they can visit philosophy.org. Our social media connections are down on the right-hand side of the page, Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, and Google+. There's also a plus sign at the bottom right of the page. You click on that, you can enter your email address for newsletter and things like that. Go to the videos page. I definitely want to plug the math that Hannah Van Hook has done, who is on our science and research committee. This is empirical, and it's irrefutable and undeniable, and it's basically what a lot of people required of the USP before they could look further. But definitely check her presentation out. Go to philosophy.org, click on videos, click on the Homecoming Conference 2016, and you'll see her video there. It's absolutely stunning and visual mathematical proof of the cubic wave field model, which hasn't happened before last year. So it's wonderful that there's so much progression taking place. There's a whole lot of really cool things that are going to come out in the next couple of years, new discoveries, new scientific, verifiable, empirical proof of concept of the Russell concepts. So just stay tuned to that, and look forward to speaking with you again in the future, Ryan. Thanks for having us on.
You're welcome. Thank you guys for taking us down this journey. Just incredible work. I've nothing but gratitude for all the time and hard work you guys have put in.
Thank you very much. I appreciate what you're doing, helping spread this message to the world.
Indeed.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I'm a truth seeker, just trying to find that center throughout my life. I look at multiple traditions. I've studied Taoism and Hinduism and a lot of Hermeticism, and I practiced ceremony for quite a few years with the Native American tradition, and I constantly see how they're syncretized. I constantly see and feel not the disconnect between all these traditions, but the connection. Just the same things in different cultural expressions, and that truth is such a brilliant thing that the world needs, because people are so caught up in whatever dogma that they've been presented as a child by their parents or by their family, or by our culture and society at large. Just finding that center. That's what I'm going for.
Find it and hold it.
Yes, indeed.
That's why they call it the great self-work. There's no public prayer tabernacle where you can go to learn about the self.
Yep.
It's a very solo journey, but nonetheless, it leads to the greatest discovery, which is the power that you've always wanted and desired. It rests within you.
Yep.
And that's why it's cult proof, because there's nobody between you and the Creator, and if there was, that's when it becomes a cult. So
awesome. Hey, thank you guys so much. I really appreciate it. It's great to actually get to talk to you guys and be candid.
And you too, Ryan. It's great to know there's other minds out there who are working on the great work of the self.
That's right. All right. Well, peace and love, and I'll talk to you guys in the future.
You too, buddy.
All right. Take care.
All right.
Okay.
Bye.
Bye-bye.